It was a cold and dark night, April 15th, 1912. The couple, Thomas and Margaret, had boarded the Titanic with their 8-year-old son, Samuel, filled with hope and dreams of a new life in America. The ship was a colossus of luxury and technology, and no one could have imagined that this would be the last day for so many lives. When the ship collided with the iceberg, chaos ensued. Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel were in their quarters when the impact occurred. The metallic noise and the tremor that followed were enough to wake Samuel, who began to cry. Thomas, trying to stay calm, told his family that everything would be fine. But the fear in his eyes was undeniable. As the ship began to tilt, the couple decided to head for the lifeboats. The corridor was filled with desperate people, screaming and running in all directions. Margaret held Samuel tightly, while Thomas tried to make way. The biting cold of the North Atlantic night air was unbearable, and the sound of people falling into the icy water echoed in the distance. When they finally reached the deck, the scene was one of pure horror. People were fighting for a place in the lifeboats, while others were already in the water, trying to swim in vain. The couple managed to get into one of the last lifeboats, but what they saw from there would haunt them forever. As the Titanic sank, illuminated by the lights that still worked, the sea around it was filled with bodies. People who had jumped or fallen from the ship now floated lifelessly, their clothes soaked and their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Samuel, still in shock, asked his mother why those people weren't moving. Margaret, with tears in her eyes, didn't know what to say. The silence that followed the sinking was almost worse than the screams. The lifeboat floated in a sea of death, surrounded by bodies that swayed gently with the waves. Thomas tried to cover Samuel's eyes, but the boy had already seen too much. The couple embraced, trying to find comfort in each other, but the weight of that night was unbearable. When the rescue finally arrived, the sun was beginning to rise, illuminating the scene of destruction. The couple and their son were taken aboard the Carpathia, but the trauma remained. Samuel was never the same, often waking up from nightmares where he saw the faces of those who had died that night. Thomas and Margaret tried to move on, but the memory of those bodies floating in the icy sea never left them. Years later, the couple still wondered how they had survived when so many others had not. The Titanic had sunk, but the nightmare they had lived through remained alive in their minds, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the horror they had witnessed on that fateful night. The years that followed the Titanic disaster were marked by a heavy silence in the home of Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel. The couple tried to rebuild their lives, but the trauma of that night was like a shadow that never left them. Samuel, now a teenager, carried a deep melancholy within him. He rarely spoke about what he had seen, but his eyes, once full of innocence, now reflected a void that seemed endless. Thomas, who had once been a cheerful man full of stories to tell, had become reserved and distant. He spent hours staring at the sea, as if hoping to find answers in the waves that crashed on the shore. Margaret, on the other hand, tried to keep the family together, but she herself struggled with the nightmares that haunted her every night. In her dreams, she saw the bodies floating in the icy sea, and she would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. The couple tried to move away from the sea, hoping that distance might help them forget. But the ocean seemed to be everywhere, in every sound, in every breeze that passed through the window. Samuel began to take an interest in drawing, and often he would sketch dark figures of people falling from a giant ship. Thomas and Margaret tried not to comment, but they knew their son was trying to process the trauma in his own way. One night, many years after the disaster, Thomas decided to tell Samuel the full story of what had happened. He spoke about the luxury of the Titanic, about the people they had met on board, and about the moment everything fell apart. Margaret held her son's hand as Thomas described the chaos, the screams, and the bodies floating in the sea. Samuel listened in silence, his tears streaming silently down his face. "Why did we survive, Dad?" Samuel asked, his voice trembling. Thomas looked at his son, his own eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, son, but we have to honor those who weren't as lucky. We have to live for them. From that day on, the family began to find a way to cope with the past. They visited Titanic memorials, spoke with other survivors, and even wrote their own stories. Samuel, now an adult, became a historian, dedicating his life to preserving the memory of those who had lost their lives that fateful night. But even with time, the nightmare never completely disappeared. On cold, dark nights, when the wind blew hard, Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel could still hear the echoes of the screams and see the faces of those who had not survived. The Titanic had sunk, but the legacy of horror it left behind remained alive, a constant reminder that, even in stories of survival, there is a price to pay. And so, the couple and their son moved forward, carrying the weight of that night, but also the determination to honor those who were lost. The Titanic may have sunk, but its stories, both of life and death, would continue to echo through the generations. As the years passed, the family tried to find meaning in the tragedy. They had survived. Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel had moved to a small town inland, far from the sea, hoping that the tranquility of the countryside might bring some relief. But the past always found a way to intrude on their lives. Samuel, now a young adult, had married and had a son whom he named Thomas after his grandfather. He tried to shield his son from the dark stories that haunted the family. But the boy, curious and perceptive, began to ask questions about the distant grandfather and the grandmother who always seemed sad. One night, during a family gathering, young Thomas found an old wooden box in the attic. Inside were faded photographs, letters, and a diary that had belonged to Margaret. The boy brought the box to the living room where the family was gathered. When Samuel saw the contents, his face paled. "What is this, Dad?" asked young Thomas, holding a photo of the Titanic before it departed. Samuel took a deep breath and decided it was time to tell the full story. He began to speak about the ship, about the people they had met, and about the night everything changed. Margaret, now elderly, sat beside her grandson, holding his hand as Samuel described the horror they had witnessed. Young Thomas listened, intently, his eyes filled with tears. "Why did you never tell me this before?" he asked. Margaret looked at her grandson with a sad smile. "We wanted to protect you, my dear, but perhaps it's important that you know, so that we never forget those who are gone." From that day on, the family began to share their stories more openly. They visited museums, attended Titanic memorial events, and even wrote a book about their experiences. Young Thomas, now a teenager, became an advocate for historical preservation, dedicating himself to ensuring that the lessons of the Titanic would never be forgotten. But even with time, the past continued to haunt them. On stormy nights, when the wind howled and the rain beat against the windows, the family could still hear the echoes of the screams and see the faces of those who had not survived. The Titanic had sunk, but the legacy of horror it left behind remained alive. A constant reminder that, even in stories of survival, there is a price to pay. And so, the family moved forward, carrying the weight of that night, but also the determination to honor those who were lost. The Titanic may have sunk, but its stories, both of life and death, would continue to echo through the generations, reminding everyone of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. Years passed, and Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel grew older, but the weight of that night never left them. Young Thomas, now a grown man, had become a renowned historian, dedicating his life to preserving the memory of the Titanic and the lives that were lost. He traveled the world, giving lectures and writing books, always with the goal of ensuring that the tragedy would never be forgotten. But even with all his success, the past continued to haunt him. On his travels, he always avoided cruises and large ships, preferring to fly or travel by land. The sea, once a symbol of adventure and freedom, was now a constant reminder of the horror his family had witnessed. One day, Thomas received an invitation to attend a special memorial ceremony for the Titanic, to be held at the exact location where the ship had sunk. He hesitated, but he knew it was important to be there. He invited his father, Samuel, now in a wheelchair, and his mother, Margaret, who was frail but still full of determination. The journey was difficult, but the family was determined to honor those who had lost their lives that fateful night. When they arrived at the location, The sea was calm and the sky was clear. The ceremony was emotional, with speeches, music, and a special tribute to the survivors and victims. At the end of the ceremony, Thomas was invited to say a few words. He stepped onto the stage, looked at the crowd, and began to speak. He told the story of his family, of the fear, the loss, and the survival. He spoke of the bodies floating in the sea, of the screams that echoed in the night, and of the silence that followed. He spoke of the weight of carrying that memory, and of the importance of never forgetting. When he finished, the crowd was silent, moved by Thomas's words. He stepped down from the stage and joined his family, who embraced him tightly. They knew this would be the last time they would be together at the place where it had all happened. But they also knew that the legacy of the Titanic would continue to live on through them and through all those who heard their stories. That night, as the sun set on the horizon, the family looked out at the sea, now calm and serene. They knew the past would never completely leave them, but they also knew they had done their best to honor those who were lost. The Titanic had sunk, but its stories, both of life and death, would continue to echo through the generations, reminding everyone of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. And so, the family moved forward, carrying the weight of that night, but also the determination to honor those who were lost. The Titanic may have sunk, but its stories, both of life and death, would continue to echo through the generations, reminding everyone of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. As the years went by, the family's story became a symbol of resilience and remembrance. Thomas, the grandson, continued his mission to preserve the memory of the Titanic, but he also began to explore the psychological impact the disaster had on survivors and their families. He published a deeply personal book titled Echoes of the Titanic: Survival and Trauma, which became a bestseller and was translated into several languages. The book not only told the story of his family, but also explored the invisible scars that trauma left on generations of survivors. Meanwhile, Samuel, now an elderly man, spent his days in a rocking chair, gazing at the horizon. He rarely spoke of the Titanic, but when he did, his words were laden with a mix of pain and gratitude. He knew his survival was a miracle, but he also understood that the price paid for that survival was something he would carry forever. Margaret, the family matriarch, passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 92. On her deathbed, she held Samuel's hand and whispered, "We honored them, my love. We honored them." Her last words were a testament to her strength and the love she had devoted to her family and the memory of those who had not survived. After Margaret's death, Samuel decided it was time to close a chapter of his life. He donated all the family's Titanic-related artifacts to a museum dedicated to the ship, including Margaret's diary, the photographs, and even the original boarding pass. He knew these relics belonged to the world, and that their story needed to be told for future generations. Thomas, now a middle-aged man, continued to work tirelessly to ensure the memory of the Titanic would never be forgotten. He founded a non-profit organization called Echoes of the Titanic, which supported historical research, artifact preservation, and educational programs about the disaster. The organization also offered psychological support for descendants of survivors, recognizing that trauma could be passed down through generations. On a cold winter night, Thomas decided to visit the site where the Titanic had sunk, this time alone. He boarded a research vessel, and when he reached the exact location, he gazed into the dark, deep waters. He felt a profound connection to the past, as if the spirits of those who had lost their lives were there, watching him. He tossed a wreath of flowers into the sea in honor of the victims and whispered, "We remember you. Your stories will never be forgotten." As the ship returned to shore, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew the legacy of the Titanic would continue to live on, not just through his family, but through all those who heard the stories and learned from them. And so, the family moved forward, carrying the weight of that night, but also the determination to honor those who were lost. The Titanic had sunk, but its stories, both of life and death, would continue to echo through the generations, reminding everyone of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. The Titanic may have disappeared into the depths of the ocean, but its legacy remains alive, an eternal testament to human strength, resilience, and the ability to overcome even the most terrible nightmares.